Before the United States entered the Second World War in late 1941, the U.S. wasn't an active combatant, but it wasn't entirely neutral either. In December of 1940, after the Nazi invasion of France, President Franklin Roosevelt initiated a program to assist the British, who were being assailed on all fronts by Germany. He likened it to helping a neighbor out when their house was on fire. The program continued throughout the war and changed the course of the entire conflict. Learn more about Lend Lease and how America's industrial capacity shaped World War II on this episode of Everything Everywhere Daily. This episode is sponsored by Aura Frames. I've told you how much I love Aura Frames. However, I'm not the only one. It was selected 3 times as one of Oprah's favorite things and named the #1 digital picture frame by Wirecutter, The Strategist, Wired Magazine, and PC Magazine. It was also recommended by Good Morning America, The Today Show, Forbes, The Wall Street Journal, and more. With Aura Frames, you can set it up quickly, update it from anywhere, and be sure that the images will be displayed in the highest quality possible. If you want to give the gift of memories this holiday, there might be no better way to do it than with Aura Frames. For a limited time, save on the perfect gift by visiting auraframes.com to get $35 off Aura's best-selling Carver Mat frames, named #1 by Wirecutter, by using promo code DAILY at checkout. That's AURA frames.com, promo code DAILY. This deal is exclusive to listeners and frames sell out fast, so order yours now to get it in time for the holidays. Support the show by mentioning it at checkout. Terms and conditions apply. This episode is sponsored by Quince. Temperatures are dropping and the holidays will soon be upon us. This is when you want your wardrobe to just work. Stuff that looks sharp, feels good, and you'll actually reach for. That's why I go with Quince. I recently purchased a Mongolian cashmere sweater. At Quince, you can pick one up for $50, when you normally drop $200 or more for the same thing. They also have great denim pants and chinos, as well as fantastic down jackets, as well as wool and leather coats. By partnering directly with ethical factories and top artisans, Quince cuts out the middleman to deliver premium quality at half the cost of similar brands, and often even bigger discounts. Get your wardrobe sorted out and your gift list handled with Quince. Don't wait. Go to quince.com/daily for free shipping on your order and 365-day returns. Now available in Canada too. That's QUINCE.com/daily. Free shipping and 365-day returns. Quince.com/daily. While wars are fought on the battlefield, there's also a strong economic element that can determine the outcome of conflicts. This has been especially true since the beginning of the 20th century, when a nation's industrial output has been crucial for fighting mechanized wars. By 1940, the United States had become the single most powerful economic and industrial nation on Earth. This dominance wasn't sudden. It was the result of decades of expansion in territory, population, technology, capital markets, and natural resource exploitation that no other country could match simultaneously. To put it into perspective, in 1940, the United States was the world's largest producer of coal, oil, and steel, all of which were foundational inputs for modern industry and warfare. American coal production alone exceeded that of Britain, Germany, and the Soviet Union combined. Coal powered factories, railroads, and electrical generation, and the United States had vast, easily accessible coal seams that could be mined at a lower cost than in Europe. The United States was effectively the Saudi Arabia of the early 20th century. In 1940, it produced roughly 2/3 of the world's oil supply. Texas, Oklahoma, California, and other states generated enormous quantities of petroleum that fueled cars, trucks, ships, aircraft, and industrial machinery. No access power had secure access to oil on anything like this scale. Germany and Japan were acutely vulnerable to fuel shortages, while the United States had a surplus so large that it could supply allies across the globe. The United States produced more steel than Germany, Japan, Italy, and Britain combined. Steel was the backbone of modern warfare, used in ships, tanks, aircraft frames, weapons, railways, and industrial machinery. Moreover, American steel mills operated with abundant domestic resources, minimizing reliance on imports, thereby insulating the United States economy from blockades in a way no other European power could replicate. I lay out the state of the American economy in 1940 to underscore just what economic support from the United States meant at that time. The origins of Lend Lease lay in the deep trauma of the First World War and the Great Depression that followed. After 1918, many Americans believed that arms sales and loans to Allied powers had dragged the United States into war. This conviction fueled a powerful isolationist movement during the 1930s and led Congress to pass a series of neutrality acts that strictly limited arms sales to belligerents. At the same time, the rise of Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan created an increasingly dangerous international environment. By 1939, when Germany invaded Poland, the United States was officially neutral, but privately sympathetic to Britain and France, which were now fighting for survival. President Franklin Roosevelt understood that Britain's defeat would fundamentally endanger American security, even if the United States never formally entered the war. Early efforts to help the Allies took the form of cash and carry arrangements, under which Britain and France could purchase American weapons by paying in cash and transporting the goods themselves. This system favored Britain, which still controlled the seas, but it also rapidly drained British financial reserves. By late 1940, Britain was nearing bankruptcy despite standing alone against Germany after the fall of France. Faced with this potential crisis, Roosevelt proposed a radical solution. On December 29, 1940, in a national radio broadcast which was known as a fireside chat, he said the following, quote, "We must be the great arsenal of democracy. For us, this is an emergency as serious as war itself. We must apply ourselves to our task with the same resolution, the same urgency, and the same spirit of patriotism and sacrifice as we would show were we at war." End quote. 2 weeks earlier at a press conference, he compared lending war supplies to Britain to letting your neighbor use your hose to put out a fire so it wouldn't spread to your house. The analogy captured the essence of the idea. The United States would supply war materials to countries whose defense was deemed vital to American security, without asking immediate payment. The concept became law with the passage of the Lend Lease Act on March 11, 1941. The act authorized the president to, quote, "sell, transfer title to, exchange, lease, lend, or otherwise dispose of defense articles to eligible nations." For most of the items that were sent, it was assumed that payment would be made later once the war was over. Initially, Britain was the primary beneficiary, receiving ships, aircraft, tanks, ammunition, food, and industrial equipment. The program also extended to the British Empire and Commonwealth, including Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and India. After Germany invaded the Soviet Union in June of 1941, Roosevelt made the controversial decision to include the USSR, despite deep ideological hostility between communism and American capitalism. China, already at war with Japan, was also a major recipient. In effect, Lend Lease actually did turn the United States into the arsenal of democracy. The scale of the program was unprecedented in world history. Over the course of the war, the United States supplied roughly $50 billion worth of goods, equivalent to over $1.1 trillion today. These shipments included more than just weapons. Foodstuffs, raw materials, trucks, locomotives, rails, oil, medical supplies, and machine tools were all critical components. In many cases, Allied forces fought with American-made equipment or relied on American logistics to function at all. The famous Soviet T-34 tank was domestically produced in the Soviet Union, but the Red Army depended heavily on American trucks, steel, rails, and fuel to move and sustain its forces. Lend Lease also had a profound effect on American industry and society. It accelerated the mobilization of the U.S. economy even before Pearl Harbor, transforming factories, shipyards, and farms into engines of war production. Unemployment vanished, industrial output surged, and the United States emerged as the world's dominant military manufacturing power. By the time the United States formally entered the war in December of 1941, it was already deeply integrated into the Allied war effort in everything but the actual fighting. Politically, the program was hotly debated at home. Isolationists warned that Lend Lease would inevitably drag the United States into war, while supporters argued that it was the best way to prevent a direct attack by assuring that Britain and other allies did not fall. In retrospect, both sides were partially correct. Lend Lease did entangle the United States into the conflict, but it also bought crucial time and strengthened Allied resistance before American troops entered the battlefield. As the war turned in favor of the Allies, Lend Lease continued to expand, peaking in 1944. It became a symbol of Allied cooperation and shared sacrifice, even as it also reflected the growing imbalance of power between the United States and its partners. The U.S. shipped over 400,000 vehicles to the Soviet Union alone, along with 14,000 aircraft and thousands of tanks. Britain received 17.5 million tons of military equipment, while American merchant ships carried crucial supplies across dangerous convoy routes. The program ended abruptly in September of 1945, shortly after Japan's surrender. Remaining goods in transit were either paid for or returned, and recipient nations were left to settle accounts. How the accounts were settled at the end of the war depended on the country. For most recipients, Lend Lease was not treated as conventional debt. Consumable items such as food, fuel, ammunition, and destroyed equipment were all simply written off. Only surviving equipment that could still be used after the war was supposed to be paid for, and even then the United States often accepted steep discounts or long-term settlements. Britain is the most famous and longest case. Lend Lease itself was abruptly terminated, but Britain still needed post-war financial support. This led to the Anglo-American Loan Agreement of 1946, which rolled remaining obligations into a low-interest loan of $3.75 billion. Britain made its final payment on this loan on December 31st, 2006. In practical terms, the financial consequences of Lend Lease lasted about 60 years for the United Kingdom. China received substantial aid during the war, but its Lend Lease obligations were largely forgiven, especially after the Chinese Civil War and the establishment of the People's Republic of China. Other Allied nations either paid small settlements, returned unused equipment, or had their debts canceled outright. The Soviet Union's case was very different. The USSR received about $11 billion in aid. After years of dispute, the two sides agreed in 1972 that the Soviets would repay $722 million, a small fraction of the total. Payments stalled after the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, and the debt remained unresolved until after the collapse of the USSR. The Russian Federation ultimately settled the remaining balance in 2006, the same year Britain finished its payments. So, looking back now, how important was the Lend Lease program in the resolution of the war? Well, the short answer is extremely. For Britain, Lend Lease was essential to simple survival. Without American supplies of food, fuel, ships, aircraft, and munitions, Britain would likely have been forced to curtail operations, seek a negotiated peace, or collapse economically. Lend Lease did not win the Battle of Britain in the air, but it ensured that Britain could keep flying planes, feeding its population, and maintaining a global war effort long enough for the United States to enter the conflict. China's war effort against Japan was heavily dependent upon Lend Lease, especially after Japanese forces cut off many traditional supply routes. American aid provided weapons, aircraft, fuel, and logistical support that allowed Chinese forces to continue fighting and tied down large numbers of Japanese troops that otherwise might have been used elsewhere. While China remained militarily weak and politically fragmented, Lend Lease ensured that Japan never fully subdued the Chinese mainland, which had major strategic consequences for the wider war in the Pacific. For the Soviet Union, Lend Lease did not replace domestic production, but it solved critical bottlenecks that could have crippled the Red Army. The USSR produced vast amounts of tanks, artillery pieces, and rifles, but it struggled with logistics, transportation, communications, and high-quality industrial inputs. American trucks, locomotives, rails, radio, fuel, and food transformed the Red Army's ability to move, coordinate, and sustain large-scale offensives. By 1944, much of the Soviet Army's mobility depended on American vehicles. After the war, for obvious reasons, the Soviets publicly downplayed the importance of Lend Lease. Part of their national narrative was that they were largely responsible for the defeat of Nazi Germany, and they couldn't really say that they needed the help of a capitalist country to do it. However, in private, Stalin recognized just how important Lend Lease was. In his memoirs, Stalin's successor, Nikita Khrushchev, reported on Stalin's private opinion. He wrote, quote, "If the United States had not helped us, we would not have won the war. One-on-one against Hitler's Germany, we would not have withstood its onslaught and would have lost the war. No one talks about this officially, and Stalin never, I think, left any written traces of his opinion. But I can say that he expressed this view several times in conversations with me." End quote. In a very real sense, Lend Lease was the moment when the United States took the mantle of leadership in the world. Without the Lend Lease program, the Allies might still have won, but the war would almost certainly have lasted much longer, costed far more lives, and carried a much greater risk of defeat. The executive producer of Everything Everywhere Daily is Charles Daniel. The associate producers are Austin Oetken and Cameron Kieffer. My big thanks go to everyone who supports the show over on Patreon. Your support helps make this podcast possible. And I also want to remind everyone about the community groups on Facebook and Discord. That's where everything happens that's outside the podcast, and links to those are available in the show notes. As always, if you leave a review on any major podcast app or in the above community groups, you too can have it read on the show.